Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. Well, we're back with another edition of our Klub Outside Q&A Round-up series, where we take a look at and discuss a set of answers straight from the man himself. As always, Kubo takes and answers a variety of questions directly from fans over on his personal Q&A platform, and then we try to dissect those answers and see if there's anything of value to be found. A lot of the time, Kubo's comments are a mix of light-hearted chatter and fluff, but sometimes we're given real, genuine insight into the story and world of Bleach that, for whatever reason, wasn't found in the original material. As before, I'm not looking at every single answer, nor even necessarily looking at them in chronological order. Mostly, I'm trying to curate the answers I find to be the most interesting, and this month that involves a mix of diving deep into the hefty back catalogue of answers that we haven't yet looked at, and a couple of the most recent ones too. So this time the questions revolve around the creation of Zanpakuto, the strongest Vizard, the power of Quilge's Vollständig, and more. We'll kick things off by discussing Kubo's comment regarding the creation of the Asauchi by Nimaya Oetsu, and the order of events that led to the modern-day version of the Zanpakuto itself. As before, a massive thank you goes out to Tumblr user Reiko for providing an exhaustive, translated list of every Klub Outside answer, both past and present, right up to the most current. It's very much appreciated. So, let's begin. When we last looked at some Klub Outside answers, we discussed the earliest days of the Soul Society after the splitting of the three worlds by the Soul King, including how the pre-Gotei 13 Shinigami might have lived and fought. For today's video, I purposefully went back and dredged up this older answer from Kubo as a sort of follow-up to that last one. Although it's still light on the details, it helps to flesh out that pivotal space and time a little better. Where previously we focused on the initial meeting between Yamamoto and Unohana, here we're possibly going back in time even further to when Oetsu was first forging Asauchi. When you think about it, it's kind of crazy how deep this well actually goes. The 1000-year Blood War arc gave us absolutely loads of lore surrounding the creation of the Zanpakuto, helping to basically paint a picture of the entire process for us. We were even privy to front row seats, watching with Ichigo as his own Zanpakuto, his true Zangetsu, was crafted right in front of him. And yet so much of the history is still completely unknown. Honestly, at this point, I think it would take a mini-arc as long as Turn Back the Pendulum to really shine a light on everything I want to know. But today we've got an interesting question to look at nonetheless, and it reads as follows. Nimaya Oetsu makes the Asauchi, but did he create them with Shikai and Bankai in mind from the very outset? Or did he realise that the shape and properties of the swords changed with each individual as they used it, and that phenomenon was then given the name Shikai and Bankai by the monk? Honestly, what a fascinating question. If I might add, these are the kinds of questions we need to be asking about this time period. This question strikes at the heart of the discussion I was having in the last video, which is, how did the Shinigami do battle before they had access to the Zanpakuto? A lot of you responded with some excellent comments, by the way, talking about the importance of Kido in the ancient times, for example, but this question is a really good one. Before we start discussing this in full, let's take a look at what Kubo said in response, writing, "That is the correct order of events." Short and to the point as usual. So essentially Oetsu was just making empty swords and only realised they could be imbued with the power of a Shinigami soul after several of them experienced this phenomenon, at which point Ichibei gave these new forms the title of Shikai and Bankai, or at least at some point down the line. Since Ichibei's own Ichimonji is, in his own words, the first evolved Zanpakuto, we can assume Oetsu created him an Asauchi first of all. To really begin talking about this though, we need to ask another question, which is, why did Nimaya Oetsu decide to start forging swords in the first place? There are two potential answers that come to mind for me. The first is that the Shinigami were outnumbered and outgunned by the Menos at the time, who, as we discussed in our video on Ikomi Kidomoe, were growing in strength and numbers without the Gotei 13 yet to cull them where necessary. And so, Oetsu felt they needed a standard issue weapon for them all to use to try and tip the scales back in their favour. The second possibility is that the very idea for the Gotei 13 itself was currently being bandied about at the time, and again Oetsu felt that such an organisation should have a uniform weapon that all Shinigami could wield. I feel like both of these answers are very possible, and to be honest, they're not mutually exclusive either. Maybe the Gotei 13 was born out of a desire to push back against the evolving threat of the Hollows, and these swords were forged at the same time to help facilitate that. As always though, Ichibei remains a point of contention for me. He does explicitly say in the source material that long before Bankai was born in this world, his Shirafude Ichimonji was the first evolved Zanpakuto, claiming Bankai to be the modern name for what he calls Shinuchi, or the true blade. The fact that he calls it a Zanpakuto though, however, and it has all the properties of a Zanpakuto, means it likely came from Oetsu, right? Well, possibly not. Ichibei doesn't seem to have a traditional Asauchi. His Ichimonji's base form takes the shape of a giant calligraphy brush after all. Now the same is true for at least a couple of other members of the Zero Division. For example, Kurinji Tenjiro's Kinpika seems to take the form of an oar even in its base form as well, so maybe Ichibei's not that strange after all. However, interestingly, when Oetsu explains the fundamental law that all Shinigami have one of his Asauchi, that's where they all started, he mentions the Zero Division 2, and Ichibei is nowhere to be seen in the image that shows Senjumaru, Tenjiro, and Hikifune. So if something is going on, what's going on with Ichimonji? Could Ichibei have manifested this weapon himself and then Oetsu used it as the blueprint for Zanpakuto? Or did Ichimonji manifest as a result of the powers the Soul King bestowed upon Ichibei at the dawn of the world? Despite me just saying that, it seems unlikely that Oetsu would have used Ichimonji as inspiration if he was creating Asauchi for use by the Shinigami and didn't know they would be able to imprint their souls upon them. By the way, I think this question and answer may actually reveal that Oetsu doesn't have a Zanpakuto of his own. Now, technically every Zanpakuto belongs to him in some form or another, and as we see from the Sword 5, Oetsu has a cadre of specific Zanpakuto that help him in his forge. But the fact that he was apparently handing out Asauchi to Shinigami and only then realising they could achieve Shikai and Bankai makes me wonder if he never actually gave one to himself. Certainly from the way the question is worded, it seems like at the very least it took until other Shinigami began to imprint their souls for Oetsu to truly understand what his own work was capable of. Which again is hard to believe in some sense. As we see, each member of the Zero Division is given divine prominence over something in the world that relates to them, and Oetsu's is Zanpakuto, allowing him to even go so far as to speak to Shinigami while they're in their inner world. Nothing escapes him, so I'm surprised he didn't realise immediately what was possible with this newfound technology that he created, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how you go about accidentally creating something that can act as a conduit for a Shinigami's innermost soul. Anyway, circling back as we close this first answer out, I want to return to a point I made in the last video about a Shinigami's latent power, their Zanpakuto spirit, and the power that resides naturally inside them. I theorized that taking Yamamoto, for example, maybe he somehow channeled that flaming spirit into other attacks, whether in his bare fists or through some kind of magic, maybe even using other weapons as catalysts until the purpose-built Zanpakuto were created. Based on the answer, it's possible the Asauchi were still built to be a conduit of a Shinigami's inner power, and it's just that Oetsu didn't expect them to fully change shape or have additional stages of release when the Shinigami began first connecting to them. Yamamoto is perhaps a bad example, as his Shikai is literally just a flaming sword, but when Oetsu first presented him with an Asauchi, maybe he thought Yamamoto would simply channel any flames he had into the blade and didn't expect it to have a release command or a name or anything like that. Ultimately, it is really tough to know for sure, and all we can do is enjoy the fun of speculation, but for now, that was a good question to ask regardless. Up next, Kubo gave us a tiny bit of insight into who the strongest member of the Vizard is, though admittedly, not much. Introduced in the Rankar arc, the Vizard are a group of former Gotei 13 members who, after becoming the victims of Aizen's holification experiments, exiled themselves to the human world to avoid execution. They're an eclectic group of former captains and vice-captains and even one Kido Corps member, but after the conclusion of the fake Karakura Town battle, for lack of a better way of putting it, they've never really been given much room to shine ever again. In fact, the way Kubo uses them to constantly hype up other characters has become something of a recurring inside joke among the community. But it seems like the Vizards still have some fans within the readership, as one person sent a question in to Kubo regarding them, asking, "I love the Vizard. While there may be differences in the balance of mastery or ineptitude over the Zanken Soki, strictly speaking, who is the strongest among those 8 when it comes to battle? If the ability of the Zanpakuto is a direct attack type, I somehow feel that the user may not have an aptitude for Kido too, so I would be glad if you could also tell me who is the most adept at Kido, putting aside Hachi." It's an interesting question. Unfortunately, Kubo doesn't go into the same detail here that he did when presented with a fan's ranking of the Bambis, but the question does open up the floor for who the strongest of the Vizard actually is. I believe the Zanken Soki mentioned by the reader is the collective term for the 4 Shinigami combat arts: Zanjutsu, Hoho, Kido, and Hakuda. And so they're asking Kubo who is the strongest overall when taking those different arts into account. The person asking the question also believes that if the character has a physical melee-style Zanpakuto, then they might not be good at Kido, assuming a kind of trade-off between the two, which also implies to me that the reader thinks those with Kido Zanpakuto are likely to be inherently more powerful. Anyway, Kubo's answer was as follows. If we take adept at Kido to mean a wide range of Kido variations can be used, then after Hachi, it's Rose. As for who the strongest is, that's hard to say because it depends on the conditions. So, not a particularly conclusive answer on Kubo's part, though of course he's not wrong, it really does depend on the situation as to who is likely to come out on top. But I will say, I'm very happy to see Rose getting some love here. So he's the second most proficient at Kido among the group, which I guess makes some sense when you consider just how magical, or should I say artful, his Zanpakuto is, suggesting some level of proficiency. In the eyes of the reader asking the question, that likely puts him above anyone among the Vizard that just has a physical type Zanpakuto, but the funny thing about that is, well, of the Vizard, only Hiyori and Lisa seem to have melee-based weapons. Every other character has some kind of trickery to their Zanpakuto, even loves Tengumaru, which on the surface looks like a bulky physical weapon, is actually a fire-type Zanpakuto in the end. I suppose Kensei's Tachikaze could be classed as a melee Zanpakuto, but even then I'm not sure, as the Zanpakuto is really a wind-based weapon that creates burst explosions where the wind slices. But to go back to the start, who is the strongest Vizard? I made a video ranking them quite some time ago now. It's probably a little outdated to be honest, so I might take another crack at it in the future. You would be forgiven for assuming it's Shinji right off the bat, as he's the de facto leader of the group, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And let's face it, even for as far as Vizard go, his track record leaves a fair bit to be desired. If we assume their various skills and abilities in battle have remained mostly the same for the last century or so while in exile, or at the very least have increased equally in relation to one another, then that likely puts the 3 Vice-Captain Vizard, Lisa, Hiyori, and Mashiro towards the bottom of the pack, but I mean anything could have changed between then and now. After all, Lisa is now a captain as of the end of the 1000-Year Blood War arc and has likely achieved Bankai, so who knows what she's now capable of. Honestly, this feels like a topic that's worth following up on with a future video, so for now, I'm just going to leave it here and say that I'm glad to see Rose finally getting some respect. Honestly, I reckon he's probably in the top 3. Just saying. For our next topic, we are once again looking at Sternritter J, the jail Quilge OP, who seems to be something of a surprising favourite here on Klub Outside. At the rate we're going, Quilge is going to be one of the few Sternritter that ends up being quite fleshed out, and to be honest, I'm more than happy with that, as he's one of my favourites of the bunch. We've learned that Quilge was the combat instructor for many of the Sternritter, perhaps making him stronger than a lot of people gave him credit for, while the anime helped rectify the apparent plot hole of him, a Quincy, being able to absorb and wear Ion's power as his own, seemingly without any negative effects. This question, which at the time of recording is the most recent question, sitting at a massive number 599, reads as follows. After absorbing Ion, Quilge's appearance steadily returns to its original form, but could this be because his Heilig Shrine was destroyed by Ichigo, causing the abilities of his Vollständig to gradually wear off? Again, it's a good question. I never personally thought this was the case, though thinking about it, it does make sense. I think I just assumed that the effects of Sclaverai would wear off over time anyway, and that if destroying Quilge's halo really was behind him slowly losing Ion's power, then surely it would have just all vanished the moment the halo was shattered. We do actually see Quilge reverting back to his original self almost in real time over the course of his subsequent appearances, which is very cool. In chapter 493, he successfully absorbs Ion, the creature's hollow Reiatsu tainting him, causing Quilge to take on a monstrous appearance. Over time, however, Quilge loses Ion's teeth, returning his face to normal, and then later loses Ion's snake tail as well. Anyway, Kubo's response was quite in-depth actually, reading, "It's because his Heilig Shrine was destroyed and thus his Piskiel collapsed. The essence of Quilge's Piskiel ability lies in the fact that he has the highest capacity for the capture and enslavement of Reishi among all Quincy." So there are a few things to take away from this. Kubo confirms that Quilge began losing his stolen power because his halo was broken, but breaking the halo actually caused his Vollständig to collapse. Whatever that means. First of all, it's funny that Ichigo smashed Quilge's halo almost immediately after he began using it, but secondly, I wonder what it means for a holy form to collapse like this. Because Quilge's Vollständig doesn't completely disappear even after losing his halo. He retains his wings, his eyes, his new sword, and I think his boots, right up until Kisuke blasts him through the chest with a Kido spell. So for the most part, his Vollständig remains intact, or at the very least, the form he was wielding before absorbing Ion. And speaking of which, Quilge was already in his Vollständig before he activated Sclaverai. Now, I suppose if we go off what the anime has shown us, then when he absorbed Ion, technically was that considered his powered up Vollständig, his Sclaverai enhanced form, and so maybe losing that form amounts to it collapsing? I'm not entirely sure, and annoyingly we just don't really have any other cases to compare it to. Despite Ichigo shattering Quilge's halo successfully and seemingly crippling his ability to dominate Reishi, this is never really used against, well, any other Sternritter. Yes, Leal loses his halo and thus his godly powers as he falls to earth, but the attack wasn't targeted towards his halo at all. Though admittedly, that example definitely feels more like the collapse of a Vollständig than anything in Quilge's situation really does. Secondly though, Kubo gives Quilge yet another impressive buff. His Piskiel is the greatest at capturing and subjugating Reishi of all the Quincy, of all Quincy, he says. Considering the domination of Reishi is a core Quincy technique, that really means that Quilge should be considered up there with the best of the best, in my opinion. Once again, he proves himself to be the ultimate quintessential Quincy in comparison with much of the Sternritter. But thematically, it makes sense too. Quilge's personality has been shown to be dominant, and he enjoys conquering and suppressing others, as is also reinforced by his shrift, the jail. So for him to be the very best at quashing reishi and bringing it under his control makes total sense, and in fact was a theory many of us had back in the day. For a long time we assumed Sclaverai was Quilge's own personal ability back when he was the only sternritter to use it in the source material, and the reason for that was because of his personality and his shrift. It's pretty crazy to think that despite Piskiel being the greatest of all the Vollständig at capturing and enslaving reishi, Ion's hollow Reryoku still caused it to become such a twisted mess. I wonder if other Sternritter would have been able to absorb him at all, or if they would have been instantly poisoned instead. It kind of makes me wonder if any of the other holy forms were the best at anything, though I'm not really sure what else there is to be the best at when it comes to being a Quincy, maybe using Blute, or firing arrows, or Hirenkyaku, or using Quincy spells. I guess it could have been any of those, and having dominion over reishi really is the absolute foundation of being a Quincy, so this just elevates Quilge even more in my eyes. And finally, we're ending things with a pretty simple topic like we always do. Unohana's true name. Now this is an intriguing one. In chapter 520 we discovered the truth of Unohana's character in one of Bleach's biggest ever twists. The kindly captain of the 4th Division was in fact the sadistic first Kenpachi Yachiru Unohana, and a vicious former criminal. We then learned that Yachiru was a name that she gave herself in reference to her skills with the blade and the fact that she commanded mastery over so many styles. For some reason, I always just assumed that she didn't have an actual name. I don't really know why. I guess it was the parallels to Kenpachi Zaraki, the fact that she came from such a lawless and bloodthirsty world and so took a name for herself, almost like acquiring a birthright. To that end then, I always figured Retsu was just another name that Unohana gave herself, but this time to denote her transformation from wicked criminal to peace-loving healer. Our final question of the day echoes that sentiment, reading as follows. Captain Unohana named herself Yachiru, but is her current name Retsu originally her real name? Or is it that after becoming Yachiru, she named herself once again, this time to Retsu? Kubo's answer is simple but enlightening, reading, Retsu is the name given to her by her father. I mean, that is quite fascinating, to be honest. So, Retsu is indeed her true name, presumably her birth name. The fact that she later took a different name for herself, Yachiru, implies to me then a potential split from her family, a schism, or at least from her father at some point in her life. Maybe her family weren't criminals and her bloodlust disgusted them. Could she have been banished or discarded and chose to take a new name out of spite? Or perhaps it's the other way around. She removed herself from her family that she saw as weak, taking Yachiru as her name at the same time. The fact that once she lay down the sword for good, she returned to the name given to her by her father is also quite surprising, and is perhaps just one of the many ways she attempted to make amends for her old life. It seems pretty unlikely to me that Unohana's father, whoever he is, was still alive by the time of the present day story, so maybe Unohana was trying to honour a family member she perhaps once wronged by choosing to return to that name when she became a pacifist. Again, this is all just conjecture on my part. We really do need more information on her. Like the first topic of the video, this feels like something of a follow-up to the last Klub Outside Q&A Round-up, only continuing to highlight our need for some extra backstory for some of these characters. But that's it for another installment of our Klub Outside Q&A Round-up, this time taking a look at some questions both new and old. Like I said, I'm not limiting the series to just the newest answers, as there is an entire well rich with untapped information for us to look at, so we'll likely keep dipping into topics that look interesting and of value. But that's it for the video, guys. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Which of the topics did you find the most interesting and the most enlightening? What do you think about the information surrounding Oetsu and his creation of the Asauchi? How does that fit into a potential timeline that we're trying to build here? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. How do you feel about Quilge's Piskiel being the apparently greatest at subjugating reishi? In my opinion, making him not only perhaps the purest Quincy in the Sternritter, but definitely one of the strongest strongest, certainly one of the best at the absolute foundations of being a Quincy. And speaking of the strongest, who do you think is the strongest Vizard, and how do you feel about Rose being the second best at Kido? And let me know your thoughts on Unohana's true name, all of that down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. And if you want to support me over on Patreon, you can do just that to get your name in the credits like this and to get every video I release absolutely ad-free. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later and I'll see you then.